In the mid-1960s, a small town in West Virginia became the center of one of America's strangest legends. People near Point Pleasant began reporting something they could not easily explain. Something tall, something winged, something with glowing red eyes. The creature would become known as Mothman. Some believed it was a misidentified bird. Others believed it was something far stranger. But whatever people thought it was, the sightings spread quickly through the area. The story became even darker because of what happened afterward. In December 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed at Point Pleasant, killing 46 people during heavy traffic. The bridge disaster had an engineering cause, but in local legend, Mothman became connected to the tragedy. Some saw the creature as a warning, others saw it as coincidence, fear, and folklore growing around real events. That is what makes the Mothman story so powerful. It is not just a creature story, it is a town, a year of strange reports, a real disaster, and a question people still argue about decades later. Was Mothman only a legend born from darkness and panic? Was it a bird seen in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or did people in Point Pleasant see something that still has no simple answer? Before Mothman became a legend, Point Pleasant was just a small town in West Virginia, a quiet riverside place surrounded by dark roads, wooded hills, and old industrial areas. The kind of town where people knew each other. And strange stories did not stay quiet for long. In 1966, this was not a place expecting national attention. There were homes, shops, bridges, back roads, and families going about normal life. But outside the town, there was another area that felt very different. Locals knew it as the TNT area. It had once been used for wartime explosive storage. By the 1960s, it was filled with abandoned concrete bunkers, empty roads, thick trees, and long stretches of darkness. That setting matters, because Mothman was not first described in the middle of a bright city street. The reports came from places where visibility was poor, shadows were deep, and the land already felt strange before anything appeared. Some people would later say the creature was probably a large bird, maybe a crane or owl seen at night. Others believed the witnesses saw something that did not behave like any normal animal. Either way, Point Pleasant became the stage for something unforgettable. And as the stories spread, the town changed. What started as a few frightening reports near dark roads and abandoned bunkers slowly became one of America's most famous modern legends. Outside Point Pleasant was a place locals knew as the TNT area. It was not a normal neighborhood. It was a spread of old roads, empty land, thick trees, and abandoned wartime storage bunkers. During the Second World War, the area had been used for explosives and ammunition storage, but by the 1960s, much of it felt forgotten. Concrete igloos sat in the darkness, surrounded by overgrown land and quiet back roads. That setting became a huge part of the Mothman legend, because when people talked about seeing something strange, they were not describing a bright, open place. They were describing a dark, isolated area where headlights, fog, and shadows could change everything. Some witnesses claimed they saw a tall figure near the road. Others described wings, red eyes, and movement that felt too fast or too strange for a normal bird. The details changed from story to story, but the feeling was always the same. Something was out there. Skeptics would later argue that fear and darkness may have turned ordinary animals into something terrifying. But the people who said they saw it did not describe a simple mistake. They described being followed, watched, and chased through the night. The TNT area gave the Mothman story its perfect stage. A forgotten place outside town, a dark road, an abandoned military site, and a legend waiting in the trees. The Mothman legend truly exploded in November 1966. That night, two young couples were driving near the TNT area when they claimed they saw something that did not look normal. Not a person, not a machine, not anything they expected to see on a dark back road. They described a large, human-shaped figure with wings, But the detail that stayed with people was the eyes, bright red, reflective, staring back at them from the darkness. The witnesses said the creature moved near an old power plant area, then rose from the ground. What made the story even stranger was what they claimed happened next. They believed it followed their car. As they sped away, the figure was said to keep pace nearby. To the witnesses, it did not feel like a bird simply flying off into the night. It felt like something was chasing them, watching them, staying with them longer than it should have. Afterward, they reported what they had seen, and once the story reached the local public, Point Pleasant was no longer just a quiet riverside town. It was now the center of something frightening. One sighting could be dismissed. One story could be explained away, but this was only the beginning. Soon, more people would claim they had seen the red eyes in the dark. After the first major report, the story did not disappear. Instead, it spread. People around Point Pleasant began talking about the strange figure near the TNT area, and soon the name Mothman started to grow into something bigger than one night. Some reports described a tall, dark shape, others focused on the wings, but almost every version came back to the same detail. The eyes, large, red, and impossible to forget. For the people who believed the witnesses, the area suddenly felt different. Back roads seemed darker, empty fields felt less empty, and the old bunkers outside town became the kind of place people looked at twice before driving past. But not everyone believed it was a creature. Some thought the witnesses had seen a large bird in poor light. Others thought fear, rumors, and newspaper attention had turned a strange sighting into a local panic. That is what makes this part of the story interesting. Mothman was not just seen, it was talked about, repeated, shared, and every new conversation made the legend harder to ignore. By late 1966, Point Pleasant was no longer only dealing with a strange report from one road. It was dealing with a mystery that seemed to be watching the whole town from the darkness. Once the sightings reached the newspapers, Mothman changed from a local scare into a public mystery. The first major report appeared in the Point Pleasant Register in November 1966, with a headline describing a man-sized bird, creature, or something witnesses could not clearly name. That headline mattered because it did not give people a clean answer. It gave them a question. Was this an animal? Was it a person in the dark? Or was Point Pleasant dealing with something no one had seen before? As the story spread, more people began watching the roads, the trees, and the skies. The TNT area became more than an abandoned place outside town. It became the center of the legend. For some locals, the newspaper attention made everything feel more real. For others, it may have made fear spread faster. Once a town starts talking about glowing red eyes in the dark, every shadow begins to feel different. This is where Mothman became bigger than one sighting. The creature was no longer only something a few witnesses claimed to have seen. It was now a story people were reading, repeating, and carrying with them into the night. And once a mystery reaches that point, it becomes almost impossible to stop. Because the more people talked about Mothman, the more Point Pleasant seemed to belong to the legend. After the story reached the public, people wanted answers. Some wanted proof, some wanted the sightings explained, and some just wanted to know if something dangerous was hiding near the TNT area. Locals drove the back roads. Police listened to witness reports. People looked toward the woods, the bunkers, and the empty industrial land, hoping to see what others claimed they had seen. But Mothman was not something easy to prove. There was no clear photograph, no captured creature, no physical evidence that could end the debate in one direction or the other. Only stories, fear, and people insisting they had seen something real. Some explanations focused on large birds. A crane, heron, or owl, seen in poor light, could look much stranger at night, especially with headlights reflecting in its eyes. Some skeptics have linked the legend to misidentified birds around Point Pleasant. But for witnesses, that explanation did not always feel strong enough. They were not just describing a bird flying away. They described something tall, strange, and close enough to terrify them. Something they believed followed them through the dark. That left Point Pleasant stuck between two versions of the same story. One version said people saw an animal, and fear did the rest. The other said something unusual had appeared near the town, and nobody had managed to explain it. As the weeks passed, the Mothman story became harder to dismiss as one strange night. More reports and rumors came from around Point Pleasant, and the same details kept returning. A dark shape, wings, red eyes, and fear. Not every story was exactly the same. Some people described something near roads, others connected it to fields, trees, or the old TNT area, but the pattern was enough to keep the town watching the darkness more carefully. For believers, this meant something unusual was moving around Point Pleasant. For skeptics, it meant the town was caught in a wave of fear. Once people expect to see something strange, the night can start playing tricks. A large bird in headlights, a shadow crossing the road, animal eyes reflecting red in the dark. Any one of those things could become terrifying when a town is already talking about a winged figure. But that explanation did not satisfy everyone. Witnesses claimed the thing moved strangely. They said it was too large, too fast, too human-shaped, or too unsettling to be dismissed as an ordinary animal. And that is where the story became powerful. Mothman lived in the space between fear and evidence, between what people thought they saw and what no one could prove. For every witness who believed they had seen something strange, there were others searching for a normal explanation, and one of the strongest skeptical ideas was simple. Maybe Mothman was not a monster at all. Maybe it was a bird. Some researchers and skeptics have pointed toward large birds like cranes, herons, or owls. In the wrong light, at the wrong distance, a large bird can look far bigger and stranger than expected, especially at night, especially in fog, especially when headlights catch its eyes. That explanation makes sense to some people. A dark rural road, a startled animal, a witness already frightened by movement in the trees. In that moment, the brain tries to understand what it is seeing before the details are clear. But the witnesses did not describe a calm bird standing in the road. They described something tall, something human-shaped, something that moved in a way they felt was wrong. And that is why the bird theory never ended the mystery for everyone. This is one of the reasons Mothman survives as a legend. The natural explanation is possible, but the witness descriptions feel too strange for some people to ignore. The story sits right on the edge between misidentification and mystery. Maybe the red eyes were only reflected light. Maybe the wings belonged to a normal animal. Or maybe Point Pleasant saw something that still refuses to fit neatly into any explanation. The Mothman story did not last for only one night. After the first major sightings, reports continued around Point Pleasant and the surrounding area. For almost a year, the town lived with the feeling that something strange had entered its darkness. The reports were usually connected to the same kind of places: quiet roads, wooded edges, the old TNT area, places where headlights faded into fog and the trees seemed to hold more than they showed. Some people believed Mothman was a creature. Others believed it was a misidentified bird. But even the skeptical explanations could not erase the atmosphere that had built around the town. Once fear settles into a place, it changes how people see everything. A sound in the trees becomes a warning. A shadow beside the road becomes a figure. A pair of reflected eyes becomes something watching from the dark. That is why the legend grew so quickly. Mothman was not just about what people saw. It was about what Point Pleasant felt like during that year, a town caught between ordinary life and something it could not fully explain. But the darkest part of the story was still ahead, because in December 1967, Point Pleasant would face a real tragedy. And after that, people would look back at the Mothman sightings in a very different way. Then came the event that changed the Mothman story forever. On December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed over the Ohio River between Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and Ohio. It happened during heavy traffic at a time when people were heading home, shopping, or crossing the river like they had done many times before. The collapse was sudden and devastating. The suspended section of the bridge fell into the river, taking vehicles with it. 46 people lost their lives, making it one of the most tragic moments in Point Pleasant's history. The disaster had a real engineering explanation. Investigators later connected the collapse to the failure of an eye-bar in the bridge's suspension system. It was not proven to be supernatural. It was not proven to be caused by Mothman. But legends do not always grow from proof. Sometimes they grow from timing. For months, people had been talking about strange sightings, red eyes, dark roads, and something watching Point Pleasant from the edge of town. After the bridge fell, those stories changed. Some people began to wonder whether Mothman had been a warning. Others saw the connection as tragedy, coincidence, and folklore being tied together after the fact. Either way, the Silver Bridge collapse became the shadow behind the Mothman legend. From that moment on, the story was no longer only about a creature in the dark. It was about a town trying to understand fear, grief, and meaning after disaster. After the Silver Bridge collapse, people began looking back at the Mothman sightings differently. What had once seemed like a strange local creature story now felt connected to something much heavier, a real tragedy, a grieving town, and a year of fear that suddenly had a darker ending. To be clear, the bridge disaster had a real engineering cause. Investigators connected the collapse to the failure of a suspension linkage eye-bar, and the tragedy later helped lead to stronger bridge inspection standards. But folklore does not always follow engineering reports. In the minds of some people, the timing was impossible to ignore. The sightings came first. The fear grew. Then the bridge fell. For believers, Mothman became more than a creature in the dark. It became a warning, something that appeared before disaster, watching Point Pleasant from the edges of town. For skeptics, the connection was made after the fact. A tragic bridge collapse gave the legend a deeper shadow, and people naturally search for meaning in something painful and sudden. That is where the Mothman story became more than a monster legend. It became a question about how people understand fear. Was Mothman a warning, or did a real disaster turn a strange local sighting into something much bigger? After the Silver Bridge disaster, the Mothman story did not disappear. It changed. What had started as strange sightings near dark roads and abandoned bunkers became part of Point Pleasant's identity. For some people, Mothman became a warning sign, a figure that appeared before tragedy. For others, it remained a case of fear, misidentification, and local rumor growing around real events. But the legend kept spreading because it had everything people remember: a small town, a dark industrial area, red eyes in the night, and a real disaster that made the story feel heavier than a normal creature report. Over time, Mothman moved beyond Point Pleasant. Books, documentaries, films, festivals, and online stories carried the legend to people who had never been to West Virginia. The creature became famous, but the original question stayed the same. What did those witnesses actually see? A bird in the wrong light? A town caught in fear? Or something strange enough that people still talk about it decades later? That is why Mothman survived. Not because the case gives one perfect answer, but because every explanation still leaves room for doubt. After all the reports, all the rumors, and all the theories, the Mothman story still comes back to one simple question. What did people in Point Pleasant actually see? A creature? A bird? A shadow? Or something their minds could not explain in the moment? The realistic answer may never be dramatic enough for everyone. It could have been a large bird seen in darkness. It could have been eyes reflecting headlights. It could have been fear spreading through a town already on edge. But the strange part is how strongly the witnesses remembered it. They did not describe something ordinary. They described something that stayed with them, something that made them feel watched, followed, and threatened. That is why Mothman is different from many creature legends. It is not only about what was seen, it is about how people reacted after they saw it. The fear felt real, even if the answer was never proven. Maybe Mothman was born from a perfect storm of darkness, isolation, rumor, and tragedy. A small town, an abandoned military area, a terrifying sighting. And then a disaster that made every earlier story feel heavier. Or maybe the mystery survives because something about those reports still feels unfinished. The sightings ended. The explanations came. But the question stayed behind in Point Pleasant. What was watching from the dark? Point Pleasant moved forward. The roads stayed open. The town kept living, but the Mothman story never fully left. Maybe that is because the legend is not only about a creature, it is about a place. A dark road, an abandoned area, a year of strange reports, and a tragedy that changed how people remembered everything that came before it. For some, Mothman will always be a warning. For others, it will always be a case of mistaken identity, fear, and folklore growing around a real town. But the mystery survives because neither side completely removes the feeling. Because when people talk about Mothman, they are not only asking what was seen, they are asking why so many people remembered it with fear, why the red eyes became impossible to forget, and why one small town became tied to one of America's darkest modern legends. Maybe Mothman was never a monster. Maybe it was a bird, a shadow, a rumor, or a warning people created after tragedy. But whatever it was, the story still watches from the edge of Point Pleasant. This was Hidden Rush, mysteries, legends, and unexplained stories from Australia and around the world. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to Hidden Rush.